The storm rolled in quietly, creeping across the sky like an unseen force. Dark clouds stretched over the little town, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Rain tapped against the diner's windows, light at first, like the whisper of an old lullaby, then heavier, until the drops turned into sharp drumbeats against the glass. Inside the small roadside diner, the air was warm and filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. The neon open sign flickered at the entrance, its red glow casting ghostly reflections on the wet pavement outside. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, almost sleepy. A few tired customers sat hunched over their meals, forks scraping against ceramic plates, while the hum of an old radio played somewhere in the kitchen. Behind the counter, Emily stood, wiping down the same spot for the third time that evening. Her shift had started at noon, and by now, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. But still, she smiled, because that's what she did. That's what she had to do. The day had been slow. A few truck drivers, a couple of regulars, and the same old folks who stopped by every evening just to sip on coffee and talk about the weather. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing unexpected. Until he walked in. The door swung open suddenly, pushed by the wind, letting in a gust of cold air that sent the hanging lamps swaying slightly. A tall man stepped inside, his coat damp from the rain, his expensive shoes clicking against the black and white tiled floor. He was in his mid-40s, sharp features, neatly combed hair, and eyes that carried the weight of something unseen. But it wasn't his appearance that made the air feel heavier. It was his presence, the way he moved, the way his gaze flicked over the room, as if everything around him was somehow beneath him. James. Emily didn't know his name yet, but she already knew his type. The kind that didn't say please or thank you. The kind that saw waitresses as part of the background, like the furniture or the flickering neon sign. She straightened her apron and walked over to his table. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to start with something to drink?" James didn't look up. Coffee, black, no sugar, no chit-chat. His voice was cold, clipped, as if he were addressing a machine. Emily bit the inside of her cheek and nodded. "Coming right up." As she turned, she heard the impatient tap, tap, tap of his fingers against the wooden table. He was irritated. Maybe by the storm, maybe by something else entirely. But whatever it was, he had already decided that the world around him wasn't worth his patience. Emily moved quickly, pouring the coffee with steady hands. The last thing she needed was to spill something on a man like that. She walked back and carefully placed the cup in front of him. A single drop splashed onto the saucer. Just one, but James noticed. His jaw tightened as he lifted the cup, a heavy sigh. "For God's sake, do you even know how to do your job?" The words cut sharp, not loud, not aggressive, but the kind of sharpness that made people feel small. Emily froze for half a second before forcing a polite smile. "I'm really sorry about that, sir. Let me get you a fresh—" "Don't bother." He took a sip, grimaced, and placed the cup down with a little too much force. "Tastes like watered-down mud." Emily swallowed hard. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this man. It wasn't just rudeness. It was something deeper, something unresolved. But it wasn't her place to ask. She turned to walk away, but as she did, she noticed the way his hands clenched into fists on the table. His eyes were on his phone now, staring at the screen like it had delivered bad news. A message popped up from unknown number. "You can ignore me all you want, James, but you'll die alone, and you know it." His grip on the phone tightened. He turned it, face down. Emily didn't see the message, but she saw the way his breathing changed, the way he suddenly looked older, as if the weight of whatever was on his mind had just doubled. Maybe, just maybe. This wasn't about the coffee. She wanted to say something kind, but she knew better. People like him didn't want kindness. They just wanted the world to move around them, unnoticed, unquestioned. So she walked away. James sat in silence, staring at his untouched coffee, his own reflection distorted in the dark liquid. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something far colder settled in his chest. James barely touched his coffee. His fingers drummed impatiently on the table, his jaw tightening with every second that passed. Outside, the storm howled louder, wind lashing against the windows, making the neon open sign flicker like a heartbeat. Inside, the diner remained unchanged, warm, quiet, indifferent. A few regulars sat in their booths, lost in their own little worlds. The air smelled of fresh toast and bacon grease, the usual comforts of a roadside diner. But none of it reached James. His mind was elsewhere, trapped. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Unknown number. You don't get to run from what you've done, James. His stomach clenched. He gritted his teeth and flipped the phone over, face down. He didn't need this. Not tonight. His eyes drifted up, and there she was again. Emily. Still working. Still smiling at the other customers. The kind of smile that shouldn't exist after a long shift, after hours of dealing with people like him. It wasn't fake. It wasn't forced. It was different, and it irritated him. She walked past his table, not bothering him, not asking if he needed anything else. Just going about her job as if his rudeness hadn't mattered, as if he didn't matter. That gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. He suddenly called out, sharp, commanding. "Waitress!" Emily turned, startled. The tone in his voice was like the crack of a whip. She took a deep breath and walked back over, resting her hands on the small notepad she always carried. "Yes, sir." Her voice was calm, measured. James didn't look up at her, only at his plate, where his half-eaten sandwich sat. "What is this?" He gestured at it, as if it were an insult. Emily frowned. "That's the turkey club sandwich, sir. Exactly as you ordered." James finally lifted his gaze, his cold, piercing eyes meeting hers. "Does this look like something worth eating?" Emily blinked, surprised. "Is there something wrong with it?" she asked, her voice still polite, still patient. James exhaled sharply, the sound of a man teetering on the edge of frustration. "It's dry, bland, stale bread. I've had better sandwiches in gas stations." A few heads turned from other tables. Customers exchanged quick glances, sensing the tension. Emily swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, sir. I can have the kitchen make you another one." "No need. I lost my appetite." He shoved the plate away, as if the mere sight of it disgusted him. Emily clenched her notepad, the paper crinkling under her fingers. She could feel the burn of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she forced it down. This wasn't the first rude customer she'd dealt with. It wouldn't be the last. Still, something about him felt different, not just mean, wounded. She glanced at his hands, noticing now the way they trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. The way his eyes flickered, dark and hollow, like a man fighting a battle no one else could see. Emily took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I'm really sorry you didn't enjoy your meal, sir," she said, her voice softer now. "Would you like something else instead?" "On the house," James scoffed. "What I'd like is to eat in peace without having to deal with incompetence." The words stung. Emily nodded once, biting the inside of her cheek. "Understood, sir." She turned and walked away, gripping the notepad so tightly her knuckles turned white. A couple sitting nearby shook their heads. The old man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Even the cook, who had been flipping pancakes at the griddle, paused for a moment before shaking his head. They had all seen it happen, They all knew Emily, knew she was one of the kindest, most hard-working people in town, and they had all seen men like James before. But Emily didn't react. She simply walked back behind the counter, exhaled slowly, and forced herself to keep moving. Because that's what she always did. But deep down, something inside her twisted. James sat back, pressing his fingers against his temple. Why did he snap like that? Why was he always like this? The rain beat harder against the glass, as if mocking him. His mind was racing. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, suffocating, crushing. Another message came through. Unknown number. You're pushing everyone away, just like you always do. James's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His ex-wife's words echoed in his head. This is why no one stays, James. He shut his eyes, took a deep breath. But when he opened them, something strange happened. His gaze fell on the counter where Emily was standing, laughing softly at something a customer said. Even after everything, after the long shift, after his cruel words, she was still smiling. Why? How? Something inside him twisted painfully. And for the first time in years, a question crossed his mind. Is it me? The tension lingers in the air. The rain continues outside. James sits at his table, lost in thought. Emily moves on, but something in her eyes is different now. Neither of them knows it yet, but this night is about to change everything. Emily stood behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge just a little too tightly. The hum of the diner continued around her, plates clinking, muffled conversations flowing, but all she could hear was the echo of James's words. The way he had looked at her, like she was beneath him, like she was just another insignificant presence in his night. It shouldn't have bothered her. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who barked orders without pleasantries. Men who refused to acknowledge kindness when it was offered. But tonight, something about this one stung differently. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness creeping in at the edges of her thoughts. Or maybe it was the way she had seen his hands tremble ever so slightly before he curled them into fists. The way his eyes had darkened, not with anger, but with something deeper, something broken. She shouldn't care. She didn't have the energy to care, not tonight, not after everything. She glanced toward his table. He was still there, staring at his phone, his expression unreadable. His jaw locked so tightly, she could almost hear his teeth grinding. The storm outside had only grown worse, the neon sign flickering more violently now, casting quick red shadows across the floor. The rain pounded harder against the glass, the wind howling through the cracks of the door. A bad night for anyone to be out, a bad night to be alone. She let out a slow breath and reached for the bill. It was habit now, automatic. Write the total, tuck it under the salt shaker, move on. But as she reached for her pen, her hand hesitated. It would be easy to walk away, to let him go on with his night, to let him leave as bitter and angry as he had arrived. He would forget about her before he even made it back to his car. She was nothing more than a brief annoyance in his evening, a misplaced coffee drop, a ruined sandwich, a face he would never remember. But something in her refused to let it go. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was pointless. But she grabbed a napkin, flipped it over, and pressed the pen to the thin paper. Her fingers shook slightly as she wrote. Not because she was scared, but because she was tired of holding in the words she never said. She didn't think, she just wrote. I don't know what burden you carry tonight, but I hope life treats you kindly. Sometimes, the weight we bear makes us forget kindness. Just know, someone still sees you as human. Safe travels. She stared at the words for a moment, her breath shallow, her chest tight. It wasn't much. Just a few sentences scrawled onto a flimsy napkin. Words he probably wouldn't even read. But she folded it anyway, sliding it under the bill, pressing it down lightly, as if somehow that would make the message stay, make it mean something. And then she walked away. James didn't notice at first. He was still lost in his thoughts, his fingers tapping against the edge of his phone. The messages had stopped coming now, but their echoes lingered, gnawing at the inside of his skull. "You don't get to run from what you've done, James. You're pushing everyone away, just like you always do." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. His head ached. His chest ached. Everything ached. His eyes flickered down to the check, and for a moment, he was just going to toss some cash on the table and leave. He didn't want to be here any longer than necessary. He didn't want to sit in the stale warmth of this tiny diner, didn't want to feel the quiet pity in the eyes of the other customers, didn't want to deal with whatever meaningless pleasantries this waitress might try to force onto him as he walked out the door. But then he saw it. The napkin. At first he thought it was just a mistake, just an extra piece of trash left behind. But then he saw the writing. Small, neat, pressed deep into the thin paper. He hesitated, and then he picked it up. His eyes scanned the words once, quickly. Then again, slower this time. "I don't know what burden you carry tonight." His fingers tightened around the napkin. "I hope life treats you kindly." A strange sensation curled in his chest, a discomfort he didn't recognize. Just know, someone still sees you as human. His throat tightened. His breath came just a little bit faster. Safe travels. He exhaled, long and slow. For the first time that night, James was completely still. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the glass, the rain streaking down in relentless sheets. But inside, everything felt unbearably quiet. He read the note again, and again, and then one more time. His fingers pressed into the napkin, the paper crinkling under the weight of his grip. He shouldn't care. He didn't know this girl. She was just another face in a place he would never return to. Just a stranger, just a waitress. And yet, the weight in his chest pressed down harder, something unfamiliar clawing at the edges of his ribs. He had spent so long convinced that the world was cold, indifferent, that people were just obstacles. That kindness was just another lie people told themselves. And yet, somehow this felt real. His hands shook as he reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He didn't count it, didn't hesitate, just placed it under the check, just beside the napkin, his fingers hovering there, for a brief moment longer than necessary. Then, without another glance, without another word, he stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, but no one turned to look at him this time. Emily was at the counter, wiping down the coffee machine, lost in the motions of her work. She didn't see him leave. She wouldn't see the money until after he was gone, and she would never know what it meant. James walked to the door, the storm greeting him with a rush of cold air, the rain slamming into his coat. He stepped out into the night, the neon sign flickering behind him, casting one last red glow over his silhouette before he disappeared into the darkness. He felt lighter. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it grew heavier, pelting against the pavement like tiny daggers. The wind howled through the streets, rattling the signs and making the old lampposts sway. James pulled his coat tighter around himself as he walked toward his car, but the cold wasn't just from the storm. It was inside him, gnawing, clawing, relentless. He climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and just sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The napkin sat on the passenger seat where he had tossed it without thinking. But even though he wasn't looking at it, he could feel it. That stupid note. That stupid, meaningless note. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the words were burned into his mind now, echoing in the silence. I don't know what burden you carry tonight, but I hope life treats you kindly. Sometimes, the weight we bear makes us forget kindness. Just know, someone still sees you as human. Safe travels." His chest felt tight, his breathing uneven. He shouldn't care. He shouldn't feel anything. But he did. Damn it, he did. With a sharp inhale, he snatched the napkin off the seat, crumpling it in his fist. His fingers trembled as he stared at the crinkled paper, as if crushing it would somehow make it disappear from his mind. It didn't. It only made it worse. Because suddenly he wasn't in his car anymore. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. It was raining that night too. Not as hard as this, but enough that the roads glistened under the streetlights, enough that the cold seeped through his jacket as he stood on the front porch, watching his wife walk away. "Don't do this," he had said, his voice hoarse, desperate. She had stopped, just for a moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Her shoulders were shaking, but she didn't turn around. "I begged you, James," she whispered. "I begged you to see me, to see us." His hands curled into fists. "We can fix this." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You don't fix things, James. You run from them. You bury them under your work, under your pride, and now there's nothing left to fix." His chest burned. He took a step forward, reaching for her, but she stepped back. That was when he knew. She was really leaving. His wife. The woman who had once loved him more than anything. The woman he had taken for granted. And behind her, standing in the doorway, was the little girl who had once called him Daddy. His daughter. Her small hands clutched the hem of her mother's coat, her wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at him, waiting. Waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to fight. But James just stood there, silent, frozen, watching as the two people he loved most in the world walked away. And he had let them. James's eyes snapped open. His heart was pounding, his throat dry. His breath came in short, uneven bursts as he stared at the napkin still clutched in his hand. The rain beat harder against the windshield, the wipers moving back and forth like some cruel metronome, counting the seconds of his regrets. He exhaled shakily, running a hand down his face. Why the hell was he thinking about this now? Why was a stupid note from a waitress making him remember things he had spent years trying to forget? He looked down at the napkin again, his grip loosening. Just know, someone still sees you as human. His vision blurred for a second, but he blinked it away, stuffing the napkin into his coat pocket before the emotions could take hold. He had buried this for years. He wasn't about to let it dig itself back up now. Shaking his head, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the storm. He pulled out onto the road, gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. He just needed to get home, to sleep. By morning he'd forget all of this. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But deep down, he knew better. James drove through the storm, the headlights of his car slicing through the rain-soaked darkness. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was the only sound in the empty vehicle. But his mind was anything but quiet. It was loud, so damn loud, with memories, with echoes of words he'd buried, with the weight of things he'd never said. The napkin sat in his coat pocket, pressed against his chest like a ghost's whisper. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Someone still sees you as human. Why had she written that? What did she see in him that even he couldn't recognize anymore? His hands tightened on the wheel. Maybe it was just pity. Maybe it was just habit for her. Writing little notes for customers, passing kindness around like it didn't cost anything. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. That note hadn't been meant for just anyone. It had been meant for him. James let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing against the leather steering wheel. He told himself to forget about it, to move on, to push it down like he always did. But he couldn't, because for the first time in years, someone had looked past his bitterness, past his coldness, past his walls, and still chosen to be kind. And he didn't know what to do with that. The rain hit harder, the sky rumbling in the distance, but James barely noticed. His mind was back in that diner, watching the way the waitress had never flinched, never snapped back, never let his cruelty change her. She had just kept going. And somehow, that made him feel worse. Because Emily had every reason to hate him, every reason to walk away. But instead, she had seen him. And now, he couldn't stop seeing her either. He turned onto the highway, the road stretching out endlessly before him, dark and slick under the downpour. He should have gone home. He should have locked the door behind him, poured himself a drink, and let exhaustion take over. Instead, his fingers hovered over his phone. Something gnawed at him, something unfinished. After a long hesitation, he finally pulled over onto the shoulder, the engine still running, his breath fogging up the windshield. He stared at the screen for what felt like forever. Then, before he could stop himself, he typed in a search. Silver Diner, late-night waitress. It took a few seconds for the location to load. He hesitated. But then, with a deep breath, he made a decision. He was going back. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he'd even say. But suddenly, the idea of leaving things as they were felt wrong. For the first time in years, he was making a choice that had nothing to do with work, nothing to do with success, nothing to do with pride. For the first time in years, he was choosing to do the right thing. And for reasons he didn't understand, that terrified him. The storm hadn't eased by the time James turned back toward the diner. If anything, the rain had grown heavier, drumming against his windshield like impatient fingers. The wipers worked furiously, but visibility was still poor. Streetlights cast flickering reflections on the wet pavement, and in the distance, thunder growled low and threatening. James barely noticed. His hands gripped the wheel, his mind locked in a loop of hesitation and determination. What was he even going to say? What was he hoping to accomplish? An apology? A thank you? Would she even care? Or would she just smile, that same patient, unreadable smile, and tell him it was no big deal? Would she even remember him at all? The thought made his stomach twist. He'd spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need to be seen, that he didn't need anyone, that being alone was just part of who he was now. But one simple note from a stranger had shaken something loose inside him, something he had kept buried for years. And for the first time in forever, he felt desperate to fix something before it was too late. The neon open sign came into view through the rain, still flickering the way it had earlier. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just one or two cars huddled close to the building, their windshields fogged up from the cold. James pulled in, cutting the engine. He sat there for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel, his breath coming short and shallow. He had no plan, no rehearsed words, just an inexplicable feeling that he needed to do this. Finally, before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the storm. Cold rain hit him immediately, soaking into his coat, his shoes splashing in the growing puddles. He barely flinched. He just kept moving. The bell jingled as he pushed open the diner door. Warmth hit him like a wall, the familiar scent of coffee and grilled food wrapping around him. But something felt different. The place was quieter now, emptier. A few late-night stragglers sat at the booths, but there was no laughter, no familiar presence bustling between tables. His eyes scanned the room, searching for her, but she wasn't there. Instead, a different waitress stood behind the counter, a young woman with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She looked up when he walked in, offering a polite but tired smile. "Welcome in. Sit anywhere you'd like." James hesitated. His voice caught in his throat. "I was looking for someone. Emily, the waitress from earlier tonight." The girl's smile faltered slightly. James's stomach clenched. "She's not here, is she?" The blonde waitress shook her head. "No, she hesitated, shifting her weight as if unsure how much to say. "She quit a couple of days ago." James blinked. "Quit? Just like that? Did she say why?" His own voice surprised him, too urgent, too raw. The waitress hesitated again, then sighed, her fingers drumming lightly on the counter. "Her mom's sick," she said finally. "Really sick. She needed to take care of her, but she couldn't afford to cut back on shifts. So she just left." James felt something inside him drop. His mind flashed back to the napkin. Sometimes the weight we bear makes us forget kindness. Had she been talking about herself? Had she written that note not just for him, but because she understood exactly what it felt like to be carrying something too heavy to bear alone? He clenched his fists at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. The blonde waitress was watching him now, curiosity flickering across her face. "Did you know her well?" she asked after a moment. James opened his mouth, then stopped. Did he? He had spoken to her once. He had been cruel to her. He had barely looked at her, barely acknowledged her. And yet she had seen him. She had looked past his bitterness, past his anger, past all the walls he had built, and left him a note that had unraveled him. And now she was gone. James exhaled, pressing a hand to his temple. "Do you know where she is?" he asked. The waitress frowned, shifting slightly. "I don't, but..." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "She mentioned something about St. Mary's Hospital. That's where her mom was last time I talked to her." James felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why he was still standing here, why he felt like walking away wasn't an option anymore. But he nodded. "Thanks," he murmured. Then, before he could think, before he could question himself, he turned and walked back out into the rain. James drove through the city, his mind tangled in 1,000 thoughts. The rain had lessened now, turning into a misty drizzle, but the air still felt heavy, charged with something unseen. The neon lights of passing buildings flickered on the wet pavement, stretching into distorted reflections. But he wasn't focused on any of it. St. Mary's Hospital. The words echoed in his head like a distant bell. He had no reason to be doing this, no logical explanation for why he had turned his car around, why he was now gripping the wheel with white-knuckled determination, why his pulse was hammering against his ribs like he was racing against time. He didn't even know what he would say when he got there. "Hi, I was rude to your daughter in a diner and now, for some reason, I can't stop thinking about her." It sounded ridiculous, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to go, that this wasn't just about him anymore. He pulled into the hospital parking lot, cutting the engine. The lot was half empty, streetlights casting eerie pools of yellow across the pavement. He stared at the entrance for a long moment, rain dripping from the edge of his windshield, before forcing himself to move. Inside, the hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, illuminating tired nurses pushing carts, visitors hunched in waiting room chairs, the occasional doctor murmuring into a clipboard. James walked up to the reception desk, clearing his throat. "Excuse me, I'm looking for a patient. I think her last name is Parker." The woman behind the desk barely glanced up, typing something into her computer. "Relation?" she asked. James hesitated. "Friend." The lie felt strange on his tongue, but he didn't correct it. The receptionist tapped a few keys, then frowned. Room 317, but visiting hours are almost over. James nodded, muttered a quiet "thank you," and headed toward the elevators. His heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been. His breath felt shallow. This was stupid. This was insane. And yet, something deep inside him kept pushing him forward. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped out onto the dimly lit third floor, the walls lined with doors that all looked the same. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else. Something heavier. The smell of waiting. He walked past nurses' stations and quiet rooms, his footsteps muffled by the linoleum floor. Then, finally, he found it. Room 317. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. And that's when he heard it. A soft voice. Emily's voice. It was muffled by the door, but he recognized it instantly. Gentle, but full of something raw. "Mom, I just need you to hold on, okay? Just a little longer, I promise. I promise I'll figure something out." James's stomach clenched. The sound of quiet coughing followed. Weak. Fragile. Then another whisper. Emily's mother. "You do too much already, sweetheart. I don't want you running yourself into the ground for me." "Don't say that," Emily murmured. I just need more time." Her voice cracked on the last word, and James felt like he had been punched in the chest. He had never heard her voice like this before. Not in the diner, not when she had spoken to him through polite smiles and weary patience. This was different. This was a daughter breaking. This was someone losing the most important person in their life, and not knowing how to stop it. He had been here before. He had stood in a hospital room once, listening to quiet, painful breaths. He had watched someone he loved fade away, inch by inch. And he had done nothing, because James had always convinced himself that doing nothing was easier, that not caring meant not hurting. But now, standing outside this door, hearing the quiet, helpless grief in Emily's voice, he realized something he hadn't let himself see before. Caring wasn't the problem. Running from it was. He exhaled slowly, then took a step back. He couldn't go in there. Not like this. Not without something that could actually help. For the second time that night, he made a decision before he could question himself. He turned around, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. When the line clicked open, a voice on the other end sounded surprised. "James, haven't heard from you in a while." James swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "I need a favor." He turned back for one last glance at room 317, and for the first time in a long, long time, he was going to do something that actually mattered. James sat in his car, staring at his phone screen. The number he had just called still glowed in the dim light, a reminder of the decision he had made, a decision that felt bigger than him. The man on the other end, an old business acquaintance, had sounded surprised when James had asked for help. A donation, large enough to cover an extensive hospital bill, wired directly to St. Mary's. No names, no explanations. Just enough to ensure that Emily's mother would get the best possible care. James didn't know why he felt like he had to do it. Maybe because it was the first real thing he could fix. Maybe because for once, he wanted to be the reason someone's world didn't fall apart. The rain had stopped now, leaving behind a hushed stillness. The storm had passed, but inside James's chest, something else had shifted. He exhaled slowly and looked up at the hospital windows. Room 317's light was still on, a soft glow behind drawn curtains. He imagined Emily inside, sitting by her mother's bedside holding her hand, whispering reassurances even as her own heart fractured. She would never know what he had done. And for the first time in his life, that was okay. Because this wasn't about redemption. This wasn't about proving he wasn't the bitter, closed-off man everyone assumed he was. It was about one act of kindness that no one would ever repay. One moment where he chose to do something simply because it was right. And as he sat there, staring at the faint hospital lights, he realized he finally felt human again. James sat in his car outside the hospital for a long time, watching the glow of the streetlights reflect off the damp pavement. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. He had done what he could, made the call, sent the money, ensured that Emily's mother would receive the best care. He could have left then, driven away, disappeared back into his life, letting the moment become nothing more than a memory. But something in him wouldn't let him go. He needed to see her, just once more. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the hospital entrance. The halls were quieter now, the late hour leaving only the occasional nurse or visitor wandering through. James moved with purpose, his steps heavier than before. When he reached room 317, he hesitated for a moment before finally knocking gently on the door. Emily opened it, and the surprise on her face was instant. "James?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. He swallowed, nodding. "Hey, He glanced past her, seeing her mother sitting up in bed, looking tired but far better than before. The IV had been removed, and the room carried the quiet energy of relief. "I heard she was being discharged today. I wanted to check in." Emily's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She stepped aside, letting him in. The air inside the room felt warm, filled with the quiet comfort of a battle won. Emily's mother offered a small, knowing smile, though she said nothing. She seemed to sense that this conversation wasn't meant for her. James turned back to Emily, his throat tight. "I never thanked you," she blinked. "For what?" He exhaled, feeling the weight of the napkin still tucked in his coat pocket. "The note on the napkin that night." Emily's expression softened. "You read it." "More times than I want to admit," he confessed with a dry chuckle. Then his voice grew serious. "And I owe you something else, too. An apology. For how I treated you that night at the diner. For being..." He paused, searching for the right words. "For being the kind of person I never wanted to be." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe the sincerity in his voice. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. "You weren't the first difficult customer I've had, James," she said lightly, "and I doubt you'll be the last." "That doesn't make it right," she nodded, as if acknowledging the truth in that. "No, it doesn't. But I saw something in you that night. Something that wasn't just bitterness. Something hurting. And I think..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think you were just waiting for someone to remind you that you're more than the worst parts of yourself." James's chest tightened. He had spent years convincing himself that he was beyond redemption, that some people were just meant to be alone. But here she was, standing in front of him, telling him that wasn't true. "I'm trying to be better," he admitted. Emily tilted her head. "I think you already are." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. James looked over at her mother, who had dozed off in the hospital bed, peaceful and safe. He felt lighter knowing that he had done something good, something that no one would ever know about but him. "Are you staying in town?" Emily asked after a moment. James considered it. The thought of leaving felt different now. Less like running, more like moving forward. "For a little while," her smile widened. "Then maybe you can stop by the diner again. Under better circumstances this time." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Only if you promise the coffee won't taste like watered-down mud." Emily laughed, and, for the first time in years, James felt something he had long thought lost to him: hope. As he stepped out of the hospital that night, the air felt fresher, lighter. The past no longer clung to him like a weight he couldn't bear. The road ahead was uncertain. But, for the first time in a long time, James didn't fear it. Because he wasn't walking it alone.
Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change more than just one life. They heal wounds we can't see, mend hearts we don't realize are broken, and remind us that, at the end of the day, we are all human. James spent years convincing himself that the world was cold, that kindness was a weakness, that people didn't care. But it only took one simple note to unravel all of that. Emily never expected anything in return for her words. She simply offered kindness where most people wouldn't, and in doing so, she unknowingly changed the life of the man who needed it most. You never know who needs to hear something kind today. You never know whose heart might be aching under the weight of silence. So if you have the chance to be the reason someone believes in goodness again, take it. And if this story touched you, help spread its message. Like, share, and subscribe to Rare Tales Unfold, because kindness, no matter how small, always finds its way back.